Good morning. This is Dr. David A. Padgett. This is World Regional Geography 1010, Section 98A, Spring Semester 2021. Today is March the 8th. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get right into things here. Let's see. So today I'm going to start off with a couple housekeeping notes. And then we'll jump into today's, well, I guess we should probably go in sequence. So I'll get you started on, introduced to the research quiz for this week. Then we'll get into the lecture for this week. And then at the end of that, I'll probably take a look at a couple of the article reviews that have been turned in, just so that we'll all be on the same page as far as they're concerned. The first thing, first order of business is, again, a little housekeeping. And so if you notice, I have graded everything except for the Unit A exams. So I should have those graded by next Monday, just in time for your midterm grades. So technically this week is midterm exam week, but we had our exam a little bit early, and then you have a quiz this week. So you should be pretty well aware of where you stand in the class by next week. But in terms of where you are now, if you go to assessment and grades, I'm in student view now, so mine is going to look the same as yours. You should see, now notice I have no points because I'm not in the class, but you should see for now your grades for your writing assignments and the grade for the GIS hometown geography map. And so that should give you a good idea of where you stand in the course at the moment without the Unit A exam. Again, I'll have that graded pretty quickly by next Monday. There are a lot of them to grade, so that will take us some time. Article reviews, I'll try to get those graded too after I grade the Unit A exam. And then, of course, you have some other things coming up this week. So I'm going to get out of the student view for just a moment. So that's where to check where you stand. Pretty much just there are only a couple of people who basically haven't turned in anything, and I would assume that they have either dropped the class, but most of you all are doing okay. Missed an assignment, one assignment here or there. I don't know how many people did not complete the unit exam, the Unit A exam. If for whatever reason you did not complete the Unit A exam at all, or if you find yourself getting a less than favorable score, the main message here is to not quit. There are lots of points to be earned in this class. The way to be successful is to not give up. You do not quit. Don't quit on yourself. Don't quit on the class. Just keep working. If you keep working, you'll be fine. If you quit, you'll fail a class. It's as simple as that. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, so let's move on next to the quiz for this week. And so the quiz for this week focuses upon Unit B, the first part of Unit B, which is, I'm going to stop my share here. Just a moment. The first part of Unit B was the physical geography of North America. So your first research quiz will obviously cover that. I'm just going in here and making this visible because right now you can't see it. And then I'm going to go see if what's going on here. Oh, I know what I did here. Going to let's do another. Let's get in here real quickly. Okay. Okay, so and back to screen share. So I'm going to go back to student view just so that we're sure that you all can see everything. And so here is Unit B Research Quiz 1. Notice it's due at noon on Friday. So you'll go here, and there is the research quiz. Download that and download the answer sheet. So I'm just going to walk through how this works. It works pretty much the same way as the the Unit A exam, but it's a little bit different in that this is a research quiz. So notice it's the same as usual, multiple choice. Please read these instructions. Okay. So this is a research quiz, meaning that in addition to providing the correct answer, you must also provide an explanation for your answer. So let me just demonstrate. So here's the quiz itself. Let's just jump down to number 2 on the quiz. So notice that questions 1 to 7 refer to the map above. That's this map. So let's say you're trying to answer number 2. So you're saying a person suffering from seasonal affective disorder would be most likely advised by his or her physician not to live in the region near the letter A, B, F, Q, E, or G. So the large letters pertain to the letters that we see here on the map. Okay. So let's say you decide your answer is going to be, let's say, D for whatever. For D, let's say you say, well, it should be D. So in the answer sheet well, you should have put your name here and your T number there, of course. Make sure that's in there. Then I'm going to pause for a moment. Okay, well, let me back. I'm going to back all the way out. And I'm going to go back to student view. All right. Okay, so now we're viewing a student. You're going to go in here to the Unit B research quiz here. So you would download the quiz, which is a PDF file, and the answer sheet. Hopefully this one has some place for you to actually fill in your answers. Okay, there you go. Okay, so let's say you were planning to answer question 2. Person suffering from seasonal affective disorder would most likely be advised by his or her physician not to live in a region near blank. Okay, and let's say you decided that your answer was going to be D. So the large letters pertain to the areas on the map. So there's where you think that Q is the area that a physician would tell a person suffering from SADS not to live. So in your answer sheet, your answer would be D. Let's see, that should be here. So your answer should be D. Fix that. Okay. So now you have to provide an explanation for your answer, or really, I should call it a justification, but that might be a little bit of a term that's kind of vague. But how did you arrive at your answer? And you would say, well, now notice this is very important. Please read these instructions carefully. It says your references or your explanations must only be from Bradshaw textbook, or your references must only be from the Bradshaw textbook, any of the sources listed at Unit B reading assignment, North America Physical Environment, or the lecture recordings, or the History of Geography timeline. In other words, no Googling. Okay, there's no Googling in here. Okay, you can't say I Googled it and I found it. No, you have some very specific references here. It has to be one of these. Okay, trust me, you can find the answer here. Now, let's say let's see, explanation for this answer. Now, let's say you said, let's say you want to use one of the lecture recordings as your reference source, which is fine, but you should use a timestamp. You should let's say at 10 minutes 30 seconds in Dr. Padgett's lecture recording North America Physical Environment. Need to wrap these. Okay, I'm going to fix this spreadsheet for good. Finally. I need to make these so the text wraps very quickly. Format cells, alignment, wrap text. Okay. Environment. He stated that a person who, now this is not true. I mean, I'm just telling you, this is just a demonstration. To the New Orleans, Louisiana area may suffer from SAD due to the area being frequently impacted by hurricanes. Okay, so let's say that's your explanation. That's why you chose D as your answer. Okay, now reference source, let's say you're going to use a textbook as your reference source. Perhaps, and you go to the textbook here and you search, use the search. Oh, let's go actually get into the textbook and then use the search bar. Let's see, Hurricane Katrina. And excuse me. So this is right. First chapter. Okay, there's much more on Hurricane Katrina in here, but you might say reference source Bradshaw, and you can say Bradshaw textbook. Figure 1.2 includes a photograph of the impacts of Hurricane Katrina. All right, so this is essentially how you would answer each question. Provide your answer, explanation for how you arrived at your answer. Of course, that's taken from within the reference sources provided, and then you include a reference source that is connected to your answer. So you will get 1 point for each portion of your answer, of course. So you get 1 point for the correct answer, 1 point for the explanation, and then your verified reference is worth 1 point. So each question is worth 3 points. Now, it is possible you might get your answer wrong for whatever reason, but your explanation might be fine. And your reference might be fine. Somehow you arrived at the wrong answer. So you might get 2 out of 3 points for that. Or conversely, you could have the correct answer, but then your explanation is not valid, and then there's no reference. So you need to have all 3 parts to be successful here. Okay, I'm going to pause recording for just a second. Okay, so you'll have all kinds of resources available to you to successfully complete the quiz. You'll have the lecture recordings. I'm going to add the lecture recording for obviously today, and then you'll have the lecture recording for part 2 from last week. I'm going to post that up later on, and then that will be available to you also. Push back the date so that you'll be able to get to it for as long as possible. You'll also have the reading assignments and all those resources available to you, including the textbook, to successfully complete this quiz, which is due Friday at noon. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, so the next part of our lecture today is to get into the next part of Unit B, which is the human geography of North America. And so we spent quite a bit of time looking at the physical side. Now we're going to look at the human side of North America. And so we're going to start by looking at the demographics. And so that takes us into the textbook. Of course, we're into Chapter 12, North America. And we're going to begin by looking at the demographics of North America. And so we have a unique situation here in North America in terms of of demographics. We have a country that is very unlike others for the most part. Um, and so if I go back to figure 12.18, for instance, you all probably already know this, but we are a nation of immigrants. Other than Native Americans, everybody else came here over the last 500 years or so from someplace else. Some voluntary, of course, some involuntarily. So here's the timeline of immigration and origins of people from around the world coming to, I guess, what we call the United States of America. And this is a unique situation in human history here. When we start to study other parts of the world, specifically when we start to study the former Soviet Union, or if you go anywhere else in the world besides here, there is a much closer relationship between ethnicity and geography in other parts of the world. But here, that's not necessarily the case. We don't, as a matter of fact, our country is really the antithesis of nation states as they have been formed and developed historically for most of human history. For most of human history, nationhood is directly related in large part to one's ethnicity, right? So England is a product of the Anglo ethnic group. If you go to other parts of the world, not so much Africa or the Indian subcontinent or even Asia in terms of the nation states, but in many cases, geography and one's nation state and one's ethnicity are directly connected. We're the opposite of that. Our national motto is E pluribus unum, which is Latin for from many one. From many different groups, we form this one place called the United States of America. A lot of people didn't think it would work. As a matter of fact, America is sometimes called the grand experiment because it's very unlike any place else in the world, where you have all these people from all these different places in the world try to form a nation and get along. Now, we had our problems. We had a civil war. The nation broke apart from about 1861 to 1865, and we didn't always get along. We've somehow, even through the various conflicts, had a peaceful transition of power for the entire existence of the nation. Not every country can say that. No, if you watch the news, if you pay attention to the news, places have coups. People tried to have a coup here. They weren't really going to be successful, but they tried. But in other parts of the world, there have been times, it's pretty common, where there have been elections, and whoever was the sitting head of government said, you know what, I'm not leaving. I don't think this election is legit. And guess what? I'm not going anywhere. Or conversely, there have been elections and the losing side has said, you know what? We don't think this election is legit. We're going to bum rush the Capitol. We're going to chase the president out of the country, and he or she is going to have to go into exile and leave. And you can look at this throughout history, where many times there has been a non-peaceful transition of power. So in our case, we have all of these people come from all over the world with all these different languages and cultures and religions. and we're going to try to have all these people try to get along? Oh, no way. People thought this cannot possibly work. But so far, it hadn't been a whole lot of time. I mean, it's only been a couple of 100 years. There are nation states that are thousands of years old. We're a baby compared to other nation states. But we're still here. So far, so good. Even with all these people coming from all over the world sharing this space. But again, it's not without its conflicts. Obviously, if you've been watching any part of the news in the past year, especially, we are not like a big happy family here in the United States. We're a little bit dysfunctional right now, and probably have been for quite some time. We're trying to work it out. So in terms of our demographic breakdown as it relates to geography, let's look at that now. Let's look at our demographic breakdown as it relates to geography. And so let's look at figure 12.19. As you can see on your screen. So here we have the geographic distribution of various races, or I guess we call them, as close as we can come to ethnic groups in this country. So here we have people of Hispanic or Latino origin. Notice that there's a heavy concentration along the U.S.-Mexico border. And that is not because of people from Mexico entering the United States. There were many people of, I guess, what we would call Mexican or Latino descent who were here before the United States was formed. Thus, the names of some of the areas out west being largely of Spanish language derivation. Also notice in Florida, there's also a heavy concentration of people of Hispanic or Latino origin, but that's a different population for the most part. As a matter of fact, Miami, South Florida, interestingly enough, is called the capital of Latin America, even though it's in the United States. So Miami, if you've ever been there, is very much dominated by Latino and or Latinx, or Hispanic cultures. I mean, there are places where there is no English spoken. I mean, I've been places in Miami where people are not speaking English. They're not trying to speak English. They want you to speak Spanish. And that's just the way it is, so it's a different population. It's more Brazilian and Puerto Rican and Cuban, and especially Cuban, very dominant there in South Florida, as opposed to the dominant Mexican populations that we see in the Southwest. Then, of course, in the large urban centers, including Chicago, and then on the East Coast, megalopolis is where we find more of a intermixing of Latinx populations, and so on and so forth. You might be asking yourselves, well, what is the difference between Hispanic and Latino or Latinx? Well, notice Hispanic relates to the Spanish cultures that are dominant in Latin America. However, not every culture that is in that part of the world is Hispanic. Okay, there are indigenous cultures, there are African cultures, there are all kinds of cultures that exist within that Latin American space. And so some people who aren't specifically of Spanish descent like to differentiate themselves and identify more as Latino, but now we have Latinx, because Latino is a male term. It's a male, as Latina versus Latino. So now we say Latinx, so that encompasses both genders or any gender or whatever orientation one happens to be. But then even the term Latin, even the Latin is, and we'll get into that later, but I just wanted to, a lot of people ask that question. Okay, so that's the Hispanic and Latinx population. Here we have here at B, we have the geographic distribution of the Black or African American population. For historical reasons, the majority of about 60% of African Americans still live in what's considered the South region. As you can see, then there's been a dispersal, we'll talk about in a few minutes, of African Americans to largely the urban centers in the Midwest and megalopolis, and then of course out to the western regions. Next, we have Asian populations, which is a very broad term. When you say Asian, well, what does that mean? Is that just Chinese and Japanese and Taiwanese? No, Asian also includes people from the Middle East, which is part of Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. So Asian is like a blanket term for a large group of people from a large portion of the world. But in terms of specific locations, we see that large portions of Asians from China and Japan and places in the Far East are concentrated along the west coast of the United States, and that was their, or still is their, gateway into this country. And so, if you've ever traveled to the West Coast, you'll notice that there's a stark difference in terms of demographics. If you go to San Francisco, especially, there are certain times of day where you'll see almost nothing but Asian people, like Chinese, Japanese, very dominant in certain parts of the country there. Very different from here. Then, of course, we have the Native American, Alaska Native population. Most of the Native American population in this country is in Alaska. That's where we have the most diversity in ethnic groups. And of course, there are others dispersed throughout the large of the Western United States. And of course, in Florida, there's the Seminoles, and we have Cherokee in North Carolina and the Carolinas, and also in Oklahoma. But that's a whole other history in Native American population in Oklahoma, as you probably know that story of the Trail of Tears. So it was a forced migration of Native American individuals from the southeastern United States out to Oklahoma. And there's a whole other history behind that I don't nearly have time to get into in this class. But it's the usual history of racism and exploitation and assassination, but I won't get into all of that right now. Okay, so this map just basically, or this series of maps, just kind of tells us, where are these various ethnic groups that have come here to this country and are located in different places, and so really, this is what makes our country very special, I think, because one can literally stay in the United States and have a cursory visitation to places all over the world. I mean, there are ethnic enclaves of different people from different populations from all over the world in every city. There's little Haiti in Miami. There's Chinatown in LA. There's Koreatown. There's whatever. There's Little Italy in Baltimore. I mean, so you have all these ethnic enclaves that still exist, retain the culture that they brought over here from wherever it is they came from other places in the world. Very unique, and it makes our country very interesting, so to speak. But of course, these human populations as have not stayed in one place, as illustrated in figure 12.2. And so what we see described in figure 12.2 is something that we call internal migration. So I'm going to start with figure 12.2a. And so this figure, as you can see, has various shapes, well, specifically arrows that convey a message to the map reader. So, so for now, I'm going to just put in the chat another kind of map. So we've learned about line symbol maps, and we've learned about choropleth maps. So a cartogram, I'm going to put this in the chat. A cartogram is a map that uses shapes to convey a message to the map reader. So if you remember, a choropleth map uses color area symbols. An isoline map uses line symbols. A cartogram is a map that uses shapes to convey a message to the map reader. So the shapes here are obviously arrows. And so this map is a map of migration, internal migrations within North America and the United States. That's what we're talking about, not immigration. Immigration is when people come from someplace else into a country. These are people who are migrating inside of the United States. So the first migration that I'm going to focus upon is the migration of African Americans from the south to the north. And we're going to go to this source here. And so this migration of African Americans from the south to the north is known as the Great Migration. So this resource, the African American Migration Experience, focuses upon the migration of African Americans from the south to the north immediately after emancipation, and then the second migration was after the Second World War. We had a large movement of African American people out of the South. Let's see, I'm going to, if anybody is here I can pick on today. Let's see. Going to try to get some people to volunteer some information here, perhaps. Let's stop the share for just a moment. Let's see. Sutton. Shania Sutton.
Yes.
So you are from Detroit, Michigan.
Yes.
Where's your grandmother from?
Which one?
Either one.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Which where? Either one of them.
Detroit.
What about your great grandmother?
Detroit. But I think my great grandmother was from Alabama.
Alabama. I knew eventually. If you talk to anybody from the north, eventually, so you probably still have some relatives in Alabama. When you have your family reunion, do you go to Alabama? You still have some cousins down there?
Yeah, Alabama or Georgia.
Yeah. So yes, I think. So thank you. It's just a perfect example of the Great Migration. I think the only other person from the North in this class is not here today. But she's from Lansing, Michigan. I bet if I asked the same thing. Yeah. So the Great Migration was a massive redistribution of African American population. Um, Before 1900, or at 1900, approximately 90% of African Americans lived in what we would call the South. There were a lot of, I guess, a lot of influences upon Black people leaving the South. Um, so we have with any migration, we have pull factors and push factors. So I'm going to put those two into the chat. There are pull factors and push factors. Uh, well, let's start with push factors. That's the easy one. A push factor is something that makes a person leave a place, right? That's what makes a person leave a place. So there are a lot of obvious push factors for African Americans to leave the South: racism, Jim Crow, lack of economic opportunity, and so on and so forth. So you can see in the description of leaving the South, push factors for African Americans leave the South. Very difficult. It was very difficult for African Americans to live in the South economically, politically, socially, in every way. So a lot of now in the northern region, we saw that the industrial revolution was occurring in the uh, northern regions, and so that brought forth the need for labor. And so, beginning with the automotive industry and other industries, because the need for labor was so great, uh, I don't want to say that African Americans were recruited specifically by industry, but it was kind of a word of mouth recruitment. So let's say uh, a African American was able to get a job in one of the automotive plants, or any manufacturing plant in the manufacturing belt, and he had a brother or cousin or whomever in the South who was struggling and living under oppression. Not that it was much better in the North, but at least a person or an African American individual could leave the South, come to the North with not a whole lot of education. I mean, understand that during the time of the um, during this period of time, let's say around 1900, only about 3% of African Americans in 1900 were literate. 3% of African Americans were literate around 1900, and we know why that is, because it was illegal for Black people to learn how to read and write. And in 1900, I mean, think about that. That's 35 years after emancipation. You only had a 3% literacy rate. So, and that's why, and this is after we established all the Black colleges, and well, not all of them, but many well, they weren't called HBCUs. They were called, Negro normal schools or whatever. But yet and still, if you were a person who was relatively healthy. You could be trained to work in a auto plant or another manufacturing facility, and you didn't necessarily need to know how to read or write, or at least have some amount of, a minimal amount of language and literacy skills to work there. And so that was the first. A pull factor is something that pulls a person to a place. So for the great migration of African American people migrating from the South to the North and the Northeast, the obvious pull factor was to take advantage of the manufacturing sector. So I'm going to put in the chat, there are 4 major economic sectors. Primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So those are the 4 economic sectors. The primary sector involves the extraction of natural resources from the earth. That includes fishing, mining, farming, logging. Those are primary sector activities. Secondary sector activities are largely manufacturing. Anytime you take raw materials and make them into a finished good or a finished product, that's manufacturing. That's the secondary sector. The tertiary sector is the service sector. That's the sales, transportation, so on and so forth. Even to some degree, education is deemed the tertiary sector activity. The quaternary sector is the information sector. That's like the media, like that, or even, and some people put education in the quaternary sector, excuse me, because if you think about it, when you graduate from Tennessee State University, all you're going to take away from TSU for all your time and money is a lot of information. That's it. You're not going to get a car. You're not going to get not from the school. You'll get a piece of paper, you'll get a diploma, but what that diploma represents is that you have acquired a certain amount of information that you will carry out into this world and make the world a better place. At least that's what we hope you do, with the information. But that's it. So African Americans who left the South were primarily engaged in primary sector activity, farming, and specifically a type of farming called sharecropping. And so you've heard, I'm the son of a sharecropper. You've heard that term before, and you might not know what is sharecropping and why was it so bad. Well, think about it. When African Americans were freed from bondage or slavery, they had nothing. Many of them had nothing. Now, in some cases, in some rare cases, African Americans were given land by the former plantation owner or whomever, but for the most part, they had nothing. They were property themselves. So how do you start off with nothing? Well, in some cases, the crops still had to be grown, the products still had to be grown, the agricultural products still had to be produced. So the former plantation owners or whomever made deals with the African Americans and said, okay, you're not enslaved anymore. You can make money, but in order for you to get started, you're going to have to borrow land, equipment, seed, whatever from the landowner. And what would happen is at the end of the month or at the end of the year, at the end of whatever period, the Black farmers would end up owing more money to the landowner than they made. So they were always in debt. They could never get out of debt. It was a totally not profitable way of life. And so And in some cases, sharecropping still happens to this day in this country, believe it or not, you know. And so, yeah, so that was a huge incentive for people to leave in terms of from an economic standpoint. I mean, and in general, if you read about the primary sector in the textbook, I believe it's near page 54 in chapter 1, you'll see that the primary sector does not necessarily produce great wealth for the most part. It's manufacturing that produces wealth for the most part. And so, aside from the obvious push factors, racism, Jim Crow, just people's lives being in danger on a day-to-day basis for being Black, there was no economic opportunity. And so those are push factors that push people, African Americans, out of the South. And the pull factor, of course, was secondary sector opportunities, but there were also tertiary sector opportunities. A lot of men worked on the railroads and worked in various restaurants and engaged in other service sector activities, domestic, in the North, that were, I guess, much more profitable. And of course, again, did not require a lot of education. And that's a big point, is that an individual, and let's just say what it was, a man, could bring his family, a Black man could bring his family up from the South, and without a whole lot of education, get a job at a car plant, or after the Second World War ended, there was another huge push to rebrand, if you will, the manufacturing industry from creating munitions and tanks and bombs and guns. Those facilities and factories were converted into making consumer products like refrigerators, stoves, cars. Prior to the Second World War, automobiles were largely for upper class, but then after the Second World War, we being the United States, was very fortunate in that we didn't take the brunt of the damage. There were no bombs falling on New York City. There were no bombs falling on Detroit. There were no bombs falling in Los Angeles. We had Pearl Harbor, which was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That was it. That was the only major impact we had, and that lasted a day. Parts of Europe, parts of Asia were bombed for years during the Second World War. So after the Second World War, because we were the last nation standing in many ways, for instance, after the Second World War, in the immediate aftermath, 99% of the cars made in the world were made in the United States, and in one state, Michigan. So the manufacturing sector after the Second World War really exploded, for lack of a better term, in the manufacturing belt. So that brought another mass movement of Black people out of the South, because things, even in 1945, after the Second World War ended, things still weren't really good for Black people in the South. There are stories where African American men in uniform were killed because they were wearing the uniform. So imagine that. So here's a Black man or Black woman, or especially Black man. You go fight for this country, right? You come back, some racist sees you in the U.S. Army uniform and kills you because you're wearing the uniform that you were wearing to defend the country for this racist, right? That's how bad it was. And you can go back and look at story after story after story um, of Black men who were killed, murdered because they were wearing the uniform, joined the military, fighting for a country that would not fight for us, going overseas to the front lines only to come back and sit on the back of the bus, right? That's what was happening. So a lot of Black people, even after the Second World War, who were living in the South, said we need to leave. This is not working. And the manufacturing sector was exploding in the North because the rest of the world was in disarray. When we bombed, we nuked Japan into oblivion. Europe was destroyed after 4 years of constant bombing. I mean, there had to be a massive rebuilding campaign to bring those parts of the world back. In the meantime, the manufacturing sector here was just flourishing. So it opened up lots of opportunities for Black people, again, without the necessity for a lot of education. Very important. So again, you could be a Black man who had 6 children and you bring all them up and your wife to Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Baltimore or wherever, and you can get a job in a manufacturing facility with your 3rd grade education and still take care of your wife and children as a man during that time. Unfortunately, those conditions did not remain in place. Things changed a bit. And so if we go here, this is a very interesting news story that kind of illustrates what started to happen in the United States and really, really, really impacted African-American people and led to another migration that I'm going to talk about in a few moments. So here's an article from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and notice the timeline here. Here are manufacturing jobs in Philadelphia. Notice here it is 1970. So 1970 was when you still had this post-World War II strong representation of manufacturing jobs in the manufacturing belt. Chicago, Boston, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, these cities that were made up the manufacturing belt, these cities that drew African Americans to these cities or drew them towards these secondary sector manufacturing jobs, where you really had the establishment of a Black middle class. And in many cases, even where I grew up in Baltimore, a lot of the fathers worked in the steel mills and the mothers were school teachers. So as a Black man, you would go to work in a steel mill and you'd pay for your wife to go to Morgan State or Cheney or to go to Central State in Ohio or Tennessee State or wherever. You would pay for your wife to go and get a degree in education, and she would then become a school teacher. So now you've got a Black man who's working as in a steel mill or car plant, and a woman who's a teacher, and that's the roots of the Black middle class. So you had this burgeoning Black middle class begin to develop in this manufacturing belt and in megalopolis. However, that was all cut short as the rest of the world began to catch up in terms of manufacturing. So we saw Japan, right? Japan was occupied by the United States for 9 years after the Second World War. And so Japan was rebuilt. All of a sudden, Japan starts to become this manufacturing giant. South Korea starts to engage in manufacturing. China China was the biggest one. Now, China was largely cut off from the rest of the world as economically and socially and pretty much politically until after Mao Zedong's death in the 1970s. Those who came after Mao decided to open China up to the world beginning in the 1970s. And now we know now that as a result, China is a dominant force in manufacturing. Anything, these phones, these smartphones, they're all made in China. Think of any appliance, almost everything that you get out of Walmart, all these products now made in China. 1 out of every 6 people in the world lives in China. They have 1/6 of the world's population. That's a lot of people. That's a massive labor force. And it's cheap labor. Somebody working if somebody was working in a manufacturing plant here, was trying to make was making these iPhones, they'd have to be paid at least 20, 27, 28, who knows how many dollars per hour. Then add on that benefits and health insurance, dental plan, pension. That's a lot of money to employ a worker here in the United States. So, but if you open up a plant in China, if Apple opens up a plant in China, they can pay somebody making this phone $2 or $3 a day, not an hour, a day, right? So that makes more profits for the manufacturer, and it makes the products cheaper for us. Could you look, if these phones were made here, most of us couldn't afford them. I mean, you think, oh wow, that phone costs $700, and you gotta have a payment plan just to have one of these phones that costs $700,000, $800,000, $1,100 or whatever. You can't go in the store and buy one of these cash. You can't do it. You don't have $1,000, but you can put it on a payment plan and roll it over for God knows how many years before you can afford this. And that's with it being made in China with $2 and $3 a day labor. No health insurance plan, no pension, no retirement plan, right? So imagine if people making $27, $28, $29 per hour were making these phones here. Guess how much they would cost? None of us could afford them. So really, the decline in manufacturing jobs here has resulted in a shift of those secondary sector jobs to places where these products can be made more cheaply, such as China and wherever, Vietnam, India, you name it. As a result, we lost manufacturing jobs here. So if you look at Philadelphia, this is just one city. In 1970, almost 250,000 manufacturing jobs in Philadelphia. 35 short years later, 35 short years later, and that's not a lot of time, almost all those jobs were gone. And it's not just the jobs, it's families. Somebody who had that job in that manufacturing plant was taking care of a family. That job's gone. And it's not as if if you've been working in a facility for like 20 years, as many of these individuals were, and all of a sudden your job goes overseas, and that's all you've done with your high school education or your GED is working this washing machine plant or this refrigerator manufacturing plant. That's all you've done since you got out of high school. And now you're probably making a pretty good living. Maybe you're making $25, $26 per hour, right? You got a nice house. You're living well. Then all of a sudden that job gets snatched away from you. You can't just walk out of there and go to another job. You only know how to do one thing. So what happens? You lose your house, you lose your job, maybe lose your family, right? This is what started to happen in many cities. And that's just with the general population. So you can only imagine what was happening when Black people and Black men started to lose these manufacturing jobs in the manufacturing belt. You can only imagine. Well, you might not have to imagine. You pretty much can see what has happened in some of our neighborhoods in Detroit and Flint and and Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. You can see what's happening to black neighborhoods with the loss of these manufacturing sector jobs. So I'm going to we're going to pick this up from here on Wednesday. You need to be working on the quiz. In the meantime, I am going to bring this into an end right now. I'm going to stop recording. Thank you very much for your attendance if you were here. If you were not here, please watch this recording when you have a moment.